I'm going to try to stand and speak, and the microphone stand here. Okay. My name is Dr. Kevin Galat. I'm a Ph.D. chemist by training. But in this, in my studies and in trying to figure out, what I needed to know as a chemist, at the age of 35, my mother shows up on my doorstep, hands me a stack of papers on autism, and tells me that I had been diagnosed at the age of 5. So I was not told that I had autism, but yet I knew that I handled life differently. I see and perceive forms like Dr. Grandin describes differently. But it does not mean, however, that by any means am I disabled. In fact, the last time I checked, the operant idea in 1972, which is when I was diagnosed, you were brain damaged if you had autism. A PhD in chemistry kind of argues against that, don't you think? However, the journey wasn't always straight. The journey took twists and turns that for someone who is on the spectrum, you have to learn to grow. You have to learn to extend beyond who you are, to change. Because in this life, change is a constant. It's a given. Unfortunately, when you're on the spectrum, you like to try to control the world around you because the world comes at you in a flat plane. Anything, motion of the leaves due to wind, the wind, smell, sight, inside people, the emotions that people display due to tone of voice, etc. For me, it all comes as a flat plane. Internally, I have to actually process that all through in terms of yes, no, if, then, to make sense of it and to drop the unimportant things to the floor. The fact that I'm able to do that in near real time allows me to operate in a way that most would consider, quote, normal. Does not mean, however, that I conform. I've learned to adapt, and that is an important key. My parents, when I was diagnosed, heard the expert's opinion that I needed to be put in an institution, that I would never be able to expand and grow and become what I am today. Their assumption was that I was brain damaged. My mother flat out refused, and I'm grateful for that. It's not to say that they didn't have a challenge. My father was a dentist. My mother was a registered nurse. They're both highly intelligent themselves. In this, they did see the flashes of intelligence because I was their kid that the experts missed with their tests and with their observations, etc. To give you an idea, my father built a house, a beautiful house, big, and out in the country, in Illinois, during the middle of summer, we were seeing 95 degrees, 90% humidity out amongst the cornfields. Well, as a kid, I had already pulled the cover off the thermostat, figured out the function of how it worked. It was hot. I was sticky. I turned the thermostat down to 60. Of course, the air conditioner doesn't kick off. It just continuously runs. And Dad gets home. The house is ice cold. He goes down. He finds the A-frame that the coolant goes through to absorb the heat from the house. And it's icing over. Kevin? Yes, sir. I show up at my dad's feet. Did you touch the thermostat? Yes, sir. You are not allowed to touch the thermostat anymore. Yes, sir. But because I had already figured out how a thermostat worked, the next day, of course, it was still middle of summer, 95 degrees, 90% humidity. I go down and get my dad's heat lamp, wire it up, and shine it directly on the thermostat. Now, when the thermostat's reading 90 degrees, do you think the air conditioner is going to turn off? My dad didn't yell at me that day, but he told me some decades later he didn't know whether to laugh or kill me. In this, also, my father had evening hours that he had for long procedures that he did as a dentist. And I discovered the town library, and I go down, they said, it's $5 to get a library card. Dad said, even though I'm not a resident of the town, my dental office is. I pay taxes to the taxing district that the library's in. And he sent me back and told me to tell them that, and that I was to request politely a 25-cent library card. And I got it. Found out that the number of books I could check out was 15. I checked out 15 books. I have a brother and sister, and each of them take the library card after I was done, go down, try to get the books. Negotiations back and forth because my brother and sister could only read one book a week. I would check out 13. My brother and sister each got one, and we were all perfectly happy. I read books at a clip exceeding that 13 books a week for years. I read through in separate sets of encyclopedias, dictionaries, just for fun, because of the amount of information. I was reading at a collegiate level by the time I was in 5th grade. The amount of information I was absorbing was well beyond that of the teaching that you get in elementary education. I had a really good teacher, though, in 3rd grade that decided that she was going to hold me to account and worked with my parents to make that happen. And that was the initial learning to work and to show the work that's so important later on in life. And I'm grateful that my parents started that when I was young. You can't teach this stuff as a teenager and expect it to be there unless you inculcate this all day long. Along with that, and my upbringing, my parents required a specific set of rules to be followed in the house. When you're raising a kid on the spectrum, allowing things to float does not work. The points of teaching, the points of reference have to be based out of immutable sets of standards, both moral and factual. Remember what I said earlier, the world for me comes at me at a flat plane. In order to make those differentiations, you have to have a foundation to work from. Without that foundation, the building collapses. However, not all of my teachers were the greatest. Unfortunately, I had a 5th grade teacher that allowed the class to run riot, in part directly over the top of me. This teacher also said, "You don't understand anything," handed me 2nd grade work in 5th grade. I was reading my mom and dad's collegiate textbooks on history at this point. I full well understood 8th grade work and I go and pull from the back saying, this is what I understand, she said no and lost me as a student right then and there. For me, fifth grade wasn't worth plugged nickel. I mean, that might sound a bit harsh in assessment, but the difference between a good teacher and a bad teacher can be dramatic. The good teachers will challenge and hold the student to account, and I needed that aspect and discipline in the classroom. Also, in my early childhood and during this time, there was a gentleman in the church that we went to at the time. His name was Harley. Now, Harley was a 6'4" giant of a man, wrestler build, and took me underneath his wing and actually began to teach me what love meant. Emotion, as you understand it, doesn't exist for me, but actions speak very loudly. True love is not an emotion. It's a choice, irrespective of how you feel, to treat another with grace, mercy, gentleness, and kindness. And this Harley showed me by example. In fact, the example he set in treating others with kindness and grace was such that even at that time, I made an effort to meet that standard. Now, my parents also taught the same thing. So this wasn't just outside the home. I saw this also in the home. Harley, unfortunately, passed when I was 9 years old at the age of, in the year 1976. And in that same year also, I lost my grandmother. Don't think for a moment, even though you don't telegraph the emotion when you have autism, you're on the spectrum, that you don't feel it. It's there. The thing that people misread is the fact that you don't see or process information. And my peers actually took it upon themselves to be absolutely cruel. A decade or two later, some of them came back to me and said, we're sorry for what we did. We should have never treated you the way we did when we were in grade school and junior high. But you learn also to shut your emotions down at that point. However, having what I have in ability and talent, I didn't stop growing. I didn't stop learning. And I've had an incredible series of people that have been in my life. And amongst them are my parents and Harley. And there are two others that I'm going to mention here. And that are, one is still my friend. She's also my second cousin, Ruthie. And the other is a lady by the name of Bonnie, who I've lost contact with. Both women allowed me, when I was in my 20s, they took me underneath their wings, so to speak, and allowed me to peer into their life and try to see what emotion was, because I had learned to shut that part of my life down, totally. It's not, a coping mechanism like that isn't healthy. And in relearning what emotion was and touching on that, Bonnie was almost at the point where she was wanting to shut her emotions off, having been divorced and had her heart rended because of the destruction of the relationship she had been through. It was interesting that I was able to hear her say, do you realize that in your asking the questions to relearn what emotion was, that you stopped me on a course that would have been unwise for me to take? The questions I had to ask, though, were very intimate, and some of them I could not have asked my mother without touching on her relationship with my dad. Having those mentors, though, those outside people, are incredibly critical to someone who's on the spectrum, though, because there are so few people that will give the opportunity to allow somebody to be a friend, rather than expecting them to meet all of your criteria up front. That when those people come by, they're exceedingly precious. It's not to say that friendship is easy. And one of the things I have observed, in watching other people and watching their relationships, including marriage, business relationships as well, a good relationship takes work. It takes effort. It does take some amount of pain, unfortunately, because we humans are not perfect. And if you expect the other person to be perfect, you'll never learn to grow yourself. You'll stop. Those aspects and those things don't come easy. They do not come overnight. But they do come when people are willing to be, as I said, kind, gentle, gracious, and merciful. And that is not easy to do. That flies in the face of most human choice. We can pick and choose our friends, one person said to me. And another person said, I learned that when I give people the space to be who they are, I grow in turn. Who showed more wisdom? It's not in being comfortable that you learn and grow the most. It's willing to push beyond the limits of who you are to get to where you need to be. One of the lessons that I had to learn was to do the work. In high school, I was being distracted, didn't do my homework, didn't feel the need for it. My English teacher called me to the carpet, and it ended up that my father, the high school principal, the superintendent of the schools are all in the same room. Now, the superintendent in the school had a Ph.D. in education. My father asked him, did you get to where you were by not doing the work? And he said, no, I had to show the work. My father said, I had to show the work to become a dentist and to graduate and get the degree. So if my son isn't doing that, fail him. Now, it was a harsh lesson to learn, but in the same token, learning to recover from failure was one of the great gifts that my father gave me. It's not trivial, because most people who are successful have points of failure in the road to the success. Example, Steve Jobs got fired from Apple, then was rehired some years later. And it turned out to be a very good experience for him when he mentioned this aspect. As I said, many of the things that I have had to learn has been learned differently. It's handled differently. However, it is not impossible to learn to deal with the world writ large. And in order to do that, it has to be handled somewhat uniquely, because each person on the spectrum is a bit different. But in being challenged and in being pushed to excellence is in having mentors that along the way who did that was incredibly important. Some of these things you can't teach in the classroom. You have to teach them by being present and being there. And assumptions, my advisor would say, in making an assumption with the letters S and the letter M. There are two words. One contains S and the other M, and they are ass and moron. And you can become both simultaneously. This is my college professor. Now, Dr. Youngs wasn't real thrilled about me falling asleep in class, or what he thought was falling asleep. I process information differently, and sometimes I would look away and look down. It doesn't mean that I wasn't listening or following what was going on. I was overwhelmed enough that I had to, in order to concentrate on what he was teaching, I had to pull the distractions away from my eyesight. I ended up retaking the course in X-ray crystallography. First time I got an A, my advisor decided to try to trip me up, changed every single question that he'd asked. I still aced it. He calls me into his office. He says, I don't know how you do it, but you pass it. You passed it. And it wasn't easy for him either, because I'm not certain how much. My dad did meet him once. I don't know how much he told him, or if he told him anything. But I learned and I grew. And toward the very end of my dissertation, when I was finishing writing it, I happened to be stopped by at my advisor's house to drop off the manuscript. His sister was visiting from Vermont, and his sister asked me, Kevin, what do you think Ph.D. stands for? I had my advisor standing right next to me. And my advisor, when I kind of pass off, or looking like I'm passing off the question, says, I want to hear an answer to this. Yes, sir. I said, it stands for the phrase, prove how dumb, because you learn how much you don't know. As much as I've learned and become an expert in chemistry, I can tell you there's an entire world of research and still sets of unknowns that we're still discovering. You know, I was talking with a colleague in geology here. We know more about what's on the surface of the moon than we do what's happening underneath the ocean. Both chemically, biologically, geologically. Given this, you know, the statement that I made to my advisor was really an acknowledgement in part of how vast knowledge needs to be in the sciences, but how little we do know. You can beat on your chest and say, look, I have attained. But like Dr. Grandin said in her talk here just a few minutes ago, you have to continue to learn no matter what state you're in, what state of being you're in. Anybody who stops willingness to learn becomes that typical Archie Bunker type. That does not work. There's always something you can learn from somebody else, even if they don't have a PhD behind their name, because there are experiences and things that they may have gone through that can be instructive to you. And in this aspect, the people outside the classroom, my own family members, both had an impact that in some respects exceeded the classroom instruction, which was also critical. You know, as I said, you don't get a PhD without showing the work. But in this, I had to learn to structure my life and be disciplined and ordered. And that does not always come easy to someone who's on the spectrum, because the kaleidoscope that we have to, a stimuli that we have to deal with, has to be a part of that solution. in this, experience has taught me a lot. You know, I'm not, there have been those who have been here before in this same room earlier today who advocates for those who are on autism spectrum, including herself. But Dr. Grandin pointed out that to be successful, you have to be willing to meet the demands of those who need your expertise, who need your ability and talent. And that need to push for excellence never stops. And that is one of the things my mother and father taught me. Now, there's one other thing. Mom did push me, and she said, Kevin, you need to learn a little bit of humor, because that's a part of being intelligent. 13 at the time, and I didn't see the point in it. However, there's a whole lot that goes on that when you can use a little bit of humor, it causes people to laugh, smile, relax, and opens doors. My sister, however, complained to me one time. She says, Kevin, you make my head hurt. Why? She says, your humor requires too much thought. Then she shows up for a visit and meets some of my chemistry lab fellow graduate students in the chemistry lab that I was in. And she stops and she says, now I know why you are the way you are. They're exactly like you. But, you know, it's not to say that there weren't points in time to my sister Katrina. I walked into the backside of my dad's dental office after coming home from college. And I asked my sister, who I encountered in the hall, is Dad with the patient? Sister starts laying into me only as a sister can. It's not professional. You should be coming in and asking for Dr. Galat at the reception desk. I'm like, okay, Katrina. Everybody around here calls him Dr. Galat, but I'm only one of 3 privileged to call him Dad. My father at this point steps out of the lab where he was doing some denture setup, biggest of grins on his face. And my sister turns around, sees the look on his face. She was chewing nails. Not one more peep out of her. She said, I was so mad at you later because you got one over me, and I knew that if I said one more thing, I was dead. You know, these are little bits and pieces, but I'm, you know, in a way, I've had a tremendous amount of blessing, but I've also had a lot of people that over the period of decades, at one point in time or another, reach in and touch in unique ways to help me to grow and become what I am today. And if anything that you take from this, the impact that you can have in a person's life who's on the spectrum and who struggles with social interactions, as uncomfortable as it may be for you, it can be of a tremendous value and blessing to the other, to the one on the spectrum, if you're willing to extend beyond who you are. And with that, is there any questions?
I'm curious, Kevin, if you got through your whole education, through your Ph.D. all in sequential years, or did you take breaks? Did you?
I graduated and then went to work as a bench chemist for the Illinois EPA. After analyzing water samples for a year, and I was very good at it, I'm better than that. You know, I was much more capable. And even though one of my coworkers, who I maintained a friendship for a long while, he said, I knew you were smarter and that you wouldn't stay long here because you had talent and ability that exceeded what we needed here. Bonnie said somewhat the same thing. She and I were sitting in her living room enjoying some movie on TV, and she blurts out, "Kevin, you make me feel so dumb." Well, by that time in our relationship, I had learned that usually when a female expressed this wasn't necessarily a good thing. And I started apologizing. "I'm sorry, this isn't intentional." She said, "No. You handle information and ideas in ways that I can barely comprehend with grace." It's hard to describe. Does it make me better? No. But did I have talent? Did I have ability? Yes, and that needed to be pushed, which is why I decided to continue after the Ph.D. But it took a little while. And I bypassed a master's. The difference really in chemistry between a master's and a Ph.D. is the passing of cumulative exams. I passed the cumes. Anybody else? Yes?
I just wondered if you ever found yourself, it sounds like you did a lot of reading growing up. I wondered if your parents tried to get you to do other activities, and if so, how were they able to talk you into trying new things?
Sometimes it was a challenge. I describe those who are on the spectrum sometimes needing a case of dynamite blown up from underneath them to get them to move. Not easy, but sometimes reverse psychology works. I can have this, you can't. But in the same token, when you're reading that much information, you start experimenting with it. Learning the physics of bimetal contact or bimetal measurement, temperature measurement devices, which is what a thermostat basically is. At the age of 8, how many kids do you know that will spend the time to observe a physical phenomena, in this case the operation of a thermostat, and figure out how to trick it? And not many 8-year-olds that I know of that have that kind. That was the type and level of intelligence. So my father would actually pull me out to work on a car. And even today, even though physically, I'm in a lot of pain standing now. I have injury due to sports injury, and my lower back is essentially Swiss cheese. I have bone-on-bone contact. But if I had to, I could fix a car. I could fix a tractor. I can drive a truck, semi-tractor trailer. I've learned. It's not that you can't do, but the experiences that I had weren't just one thing. I didn't sit at home playing video games. I got into the real world. Harley Gosmeyer, the guy who showed me what love was, I was being tormented by some of my peers, and he walked up behind me and he said, "This is my friend. Why are you giving him a hard time?" And all these kids are looking up at this big mountain of a man saying, "I don't want to get involved with this." But he is also, being a farmer, he took me out on the farm and showed me how to drive a tractor as I rode along with him. His sons didn't show as much interest as I did. It sometimes is bits and pieces, but my parents always encouraged that investigatory urge that I had to try to figure out why something worked and how it worked.
May I have a follow-up question, unless someone has one? May I ask if you or another family member that is on the spectrum has children? that you could speak about another question or on their behalf?
Relationships being as hard as they are for those who are on autism, your chances are more likely you're going to run into a neurotypical than someone who's on the spectrum is massive. From my observation, and now this is, with autism, I tend to speak in concrete, imperative command form of the language. So it is going to sound harsh. But it is a direct observation for me that many women expect a titillation of the emotion. That is not something that I can give. I don't operate that way. Internally, I handle information as yes, no, if, then. It takes a unique lady to extend beyond who she was, to even become a friend. Romance never happened. And the one time it might have, the person dropped communication with me without warning. So it is a challenge. There's nothing to say that someone who's on the spectrum is going to, quote, have kids that are going to be just as on the spectrum as they are. It can happen, but you know, there's that there's no real direct correlation. Even though there's genetic tendency, nobody's been able to pin any kind of gene directly associated with this, to my knowledge. So in this, there are things that were mentioned to me. Childhood development is not my specialty. I'm an X-ray crystallographer by training, so I don't necessarily study the human condition, but I'm not beyond observing that it would take a very unusual lady to walk with me. Impossible, no, but she would have to be willing to be take risks where that is not typical. And because I don't use or emote emotion as you would expect, I've been badly misread also. We make assumptions, as I said, in what you and how you choose to perceive life, and that perception can impact down the line in ways that you don't always see unless the other tells you. Does that answer?
Give more information. I appreciate that. I was just thinking about my own family and my husband and myself. Us raising a child that has it, and kind of our tendencies with our attributes as we bring to parenting, and just thinking about how we are really trying to get educated, but we have our own baggage that we're working through as we are trying to be parents. Mm-hmm. And then we've been and then you brought up what you were bringing up made me think about my son who's actually noticing love, and kind of how he's struggling with trying to kind of go through all that. So your response was just fine, and yeah, so thank you.
It's not that he can't, but it's going to take an unusual person to deal with him, with where he's going to be coming from. Because the most intimate of relationships, other things fall by the wayside. As one of my cousins told me, both my Ruthie and her husband said, living with the other is like living with your closest brother or sister, and you learn all their touch points, and sometimes you get so tempted to walk all over the top of them. As you're raising kids, you will run into that too, and sometimes they will do things that you don't expect that just drive you insane. Unfortunately, and I've noted this, kids don't come with a set of instructions tattooed to their butts on how to raise them. I have been told that if they did, that roomfuls of gold would be offered for that to happen. So Also, in this general world in which we live and move, the idea that you learn to feel what's right and wrong does not work for somebody who's on the spectrum. Allowing a person to float relative to that will not give the structure needed to become successful later in dealing with people and respecting a person, property, etc. There has to be fixed reference points young to allow for a proper foundation to be built so you can build a successful structure on top. I work from the concrete to the abstract. The other way doesn't happen for me.
Anybody else?
So I've got sort of a follow-up question to your question about starting new things and how your parents helped you facilitate that. In particular, when your mom told you that you needed to add humor, since that's not like tangible, you go out and build it, how did she convince you that that was worthwhile, and what strategy did she use to get you to take?
Sometimes she would use a little bit of sarcasm and irony herself. Sometimes it took her explaining what she meant. Some of it was by example. Some of it was seeing the, videos like, even though Bill Cosby today has a bad rap, but he did a Bill Cosby at 49 and a Bill Cosby at 50 family-friendly videos. There's a lot of humor in looking at the human condition that he had. In this, one of the things I learned was not to do ad hominem humor because that can be destructive. That's attacking the person. Given that, you can still poke fun at the condition. Case in point, and this is rather recent, like within the last few months, there's a young gentleman who goes by the screen name of Maz, who does a few YouTube gaming videos, 20-something. And he started asking me questions one day, and I asked him, "Did you RTFM?" "No." "Well, if you would have, what do you find?" And he's found it, and he's like, you could hear the embarrassment, so to speak. He wasn't wanting to totally verbalize it. And I asked, did the true problem actually exist between keyboard and chair? He lost it. Another point in time, he was having trouble, and I said, well, you get, and pulling off the same thing, I said, you get 2 cattle prods, put one underneath on each arm, set them off, and reset problem between keyboard and chair. And again, he was kind of upset, but he started laughing at the same time. Scientific humor itself is also unique. And we tend to look at something and poke fun at things. Some people saying, well, we need to go back to the caveman diet and the ideas and go pre-industrial with, you've heard some of the environmentalists say this stuff. And I have come up with a few pieces of humor. Some of it's not always politically correct, but it does acknowledge the human condition. And one day we were talking about the respect that one needs to have toward another human being, including intimacy. I made the comment, the local constabulary tends to frown upon drive-by inseminations. Now, these are Ph.D. chemists that I'm talking to, and they're having to stop and think. They chuckled once they figured it out and ran with it for the rest of the conversation. 2 weeks later, I find that same phrase used back at me. Scientists do tend to use words and word choice and phrase things uniquely that it does take some thought, as my sister complained about, to actually get. But that takes time to develop. It also takes a tremendous amount of intelligence, because you don't you do these things when you're with a typical 8th grader. You won't see it. But because of the vast amount of reading and vocabulary that tends to be there amongst the very highly educated STEM people, yeah, you can get some rather interesting observations and comments phrased in ways that, hold on. And you then just start laughing because you realize they had just cracked a joke. My advisor and I, and another fellow graduate student, the fellow grad student and my advisor were going back and forth on the stability of a silicon-oxygen bond. Okay, total chemistry. Of course, they're talking about different values dealing with measurements that were involved. I'm hearing this and finally say it'd take an earthquake to break them apart, because the bond is rather stable. Window glass is silica dioxide, dioxide, silica, which is silicon oxygen bonds all over the place. My advisor just passed it off like, oh, he was an idiot type of thing. And then 10 minutes later, mid-sentence, stops and said, did Kevin just crack a funny? It took my fellow grad student another 30 seconds to fully register that I had just cracked a joke. So humor is useful, but it's also a tool for communicating. And learning how to communicate effectively does take some amount of humor. So.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but our next final session is beginning in 5 minutes. So if you have any more questions for Mr. Galat, I'll pass these to him in the hallway.